great political beacons out there that, you know, we're all for open and transparent government, and but I think we've got to be careful of some of the unintended consequences of some legislation that they could be seeking.
Well, can you speak specifically to what it is that they're wanting to do?
Well, we just, I think one of the big issues is the definition of what an employee is.
Personnel.
Personnel. Definition of personnel. It could, because one of the major cases, of course, was ours, and the definition of personnel was very, very vague. And so now, with the court case, the courts have said new personnel in Georgia City are considered personnel and can be interviewed in executive session. And the newspapers don't see it that way. So I think that's one. What is the definition of personnel? And I think that's going to be one of the things that may come forward. I think the Fort Morgan case probably is another one that may come forward. And so,
can you tell us about that case?
As to the definition of what voting is within an executive session, and those items that you can actually vote on in an executive session. And the Fort Morgan case, that one, they won that particular case. So I'm not as
press, or they being
press. No, the Fort Morgan one. And so so there are instances now based on court cases where a council can actually take a quote vote in executive session. And I think it's pretty narrow as to that definition. And I'm not as adamant about that one, but I think the definition of personnel being eroded is the big one for me. Okay.
And of course, the issue that had here in Loveland was the hiring of the city manager. But actually, I think the council has more interest in this case than the city manager does from a purely personal perspective, because it's really the ability of the council to recruit employees into the key positions. And most councils hire the manager, the attorney, and in this case, the municipal judge here. And if interviews and directions on negotiations have to occur in open public session, I think it can have a pretty chilling effect on the city's ability, or any city's ability, to recruit applicants, because there are a lot of people who have not exposed themselves. So I think this definition issue, which was pushed by the newspaper here, and their position being that you could only deal with personnel issues, and personnel would be only existing employees rather than prospective employees, is kind of an odd situation to be in for anybody who's in a hiring position. So ultimately, because the city prevailed in that point, in that case, I think the anticipation of CML and others have been that the Press Association will come for legislation this year to see if they can win in the legislature what they failed to win in court.
What's their argument in favor of that?
Makes better press? I don't know. I think obviously
why should the people have that kind of accountability in terms of protecting the employees? What's their argument?
I don't know that they've really advanced an argument, except on the basis of the law that they felt that there should be a...
And the far reach of that, I think, is the initial discussion of that I heard was the whole process should go. That every application should basically be a part of the public record, which I think Bill makes a good point, that especially in that portion of it, it would basically, anyone who currently had a job they weren't ready to quit would not be applying in your city. And so therefore you would shrink that pool of available candidates. I know that was just one of the first little shots across that bow that I heard, but I think certainly there's how you look at what's an application, what's a candidate, and all that. But certainly in our case, there were many people who applied who had no desire to announce or or discuss they're looking for another job with their current city. And once it becomes public record, that moves like wildfire.
There's another consideration to that argument too, and that is that council cannot candidly deliberate on the process of examining candidates and analyzing their strengths and weaknesses if they are open to public scrutiny. And that's a necessary part of choosing key employees. So it's not just a public consideration, but also the council policy.
I think it's worth noting too that this process already has a considerable amount of sunshine in it. At the time the council or the body identifies finalists for interview, those finalists' identities are disclosed to the public. So the public's fully aware of who is being considered. And in this case, maybe not in all cases, but I think a lot of them throughout the state, there are portions of the interview process or selection process that are conducted in public forums. So I think that's pretty commonplace, and this is one that preserves some amount of discretion for the council to deliberate in private as they reach a decision.
If I might comment at one point here, this is one of those issues where there's a lot of gray area in the discussion. There's legitimate points on both sides, and I can easily see that if the Press Association mounts a strong effort, that it would not be the sort of thing that you could kill as much as you seek to modify to find some common, area that everybody can operate within. Because that's where it is right now. You can't do this, you can't do that. Of course, it sort of come down in a couple of different directions on this. Hence, I suppose I'm arguing for a little bit of grace in the discussion if we find ourselves voting for this or that. I mean, my goal would be to look at it and say, okay, I see a legitimate point that you need that confidentiality in certain areas, but I also see the legitimate sunshine requirements, and I believe that's an ethic of government that is appropriate. And so I'm going to look for that, threading that needle to where we can either modify something that's coming down or find the common ground rather than strict yes or no.
Kevin makes a very good point. In Loveland County, there have been 3 real loud flaps over the selection of personnel. I refer to the Colorado State University president. I refer to the selection of the school superintendent in public. And I refer to the selection of the city manager here. All 3 are kind of the same issue. That is where a voting decision was made in private. That's where we lost. We were talking as though we won the issue, and we did win part of the issue on the lawsuit. We also lost $25,000. And it was on a single point. A decision was made. This is true with the Colorado University, the State University president selection. It's true with the same thing that happened with the selection of the school superintendent. The same thing happened here. And that's an issue that we're kind of attacking here a little bit, but one in which Kevin, I think, has made a very valid point.
Yeah, I think that's, there are a lot of stages in this process, and what Darrell's referring to is the point that the city did lose in the lawsuit was the narrowing of the field of candidates from 3 to 2. And that decision, the judge held, could not be made in executive session. So the law remains the same. You can't make a decision in executive session. But I think the thrust of legislation may be to simply place the whole process into public session as opposed to even having any discussion in executive session. So that's...
Yeah, and that would be the sort of thing that I'd say, time out, you can't take that. You need to give some opportunity to make those decisions that are appropriate and those discussions that are appropriate.
Joan,